The pilgrims had been walking for 11 days. They came from every hablok and agri shelf on Vothara Prime, from the smog-wrapped transit terminals of the tertiary continents, from the cold fishing platforms that ringed the polar shelf, from the tithe farms where the soil had been worked into grey exhaustion, and even the children knew the liturgy before they knew their own surnames. They came because 300 years ago, on this exact date, the body of Saint Aldrich had been retrieved from the battlefield of the Threnody Maya and brought to Vothara Prime in a reliquary the size of a gunship, and because the ecclesiarchy had marked the occasion in the Book of Remembrance, and because marked occasions demanded bodies, and bodies demanded roads, and roads filled themselves, in the Imperium, the way wounds fill with scar tissue. Inevitably, completely, 2 million pilgrims, packed into the 3 great plazas surrounding the Basilica Orantia, shoulder to shoulder and silent in the way that crowds of a certain size become silent, not from peace but from weight, from the sensation of being part of something so large it generates its own gravity. The censers had been swinging for 6 hours. The incense smoke lay across the plaza floor like ground fog, chest high, threading through the boots of the faithful, rising and curling around the devotional banners hung from every parapet and arch. Cardinal Imperial Seraphinus Drath stood at the high balcony of the basilica and looked out over them the way a man looks at a sea he owns, at a sea that knows it is owned and feels nothing but the particular satisfaction of having inherited something correctly. He was 74 years old and had been Cardinal Imperial for 22 of those years. And in those 22 years, he had not yet managed to feel anything he could honestly describe as faith. Administration, yes. Strategy, yes. The management of symbols and the rationing of wonder, the choreographing of collective ecstasy at appropriate intervals, yes. But faith was for the pilgrims below, not for the man who set the schedule. He was still watching them when the sky changed. No tear, no bleeding wound in reality. No warp scream or demonic sigil burning itself across the clouds. What happened was simpler and in its simplicity more alarming than any of those things. A shape came down from orbit under its own power, moving too fast for atmosphere entry and then, impossibly, not fast enough for impact, decelerating with a precision that spoke not of technology but of will, leaving a contrail of heated air that caught the setting sun and lit itself gold and red above the Basilica Orantia. Directly above the Cardinal's balcony, directly above 2 million upturned faces. He landed in the center of the grand processional plaza. The shockwave knocked the front ranks of pilgrims off their feet. Dust and incense and devotional ribbons spiraled outward in a perfect ring. The censers swung hard. And in the center of the new silence, standing in a crater 3 centimeters deep from the weight of his landing, was a man in a white suit with a red cape lifting behind him in a wind of his own making. And his eyes were already scanning the crowd with the particular precision of something that has learned to read rooms from a very long distance. The 2 million pilgrims did not run. They had not been conditioned to run from the miraculous. They had been conditioned to receive it on their knees. And so they did, starting from the center and radiating outward in a wave that moved through the crowd like a signal through a Vox network. Tens of thousands of bodies dropped, heads bowing, arms extending, the murmur of liturgy beginning before anyone had made a conscious decision to speak it, because the ecclesiarchy had spent 5 generations ensuring that the automatic response to an impossible arrival was worship. He stood in the center of it all, and he breathed it in. On the balcony above, Cardinal Imperiale Seraphinus Drath watched the crowd fold around the stranger like water around a stone, and for the first time in 22 years, the part of him that was not administrator and not strategist, and not the manager of sacred schedules recognized something and felt, for one long second, genuinely afraid. Then the administrative part of him, the dominant part, the part that had survived 3 inquisitorial reviews, and a succession dispute and a tithe renegotiation with 3 sector governors simultaneously, took over. He turned to his chamberlain. "Find out what he is," Drath said, "before anyone else does." It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes during which the stranger did not move from the crater. during which the crowd maintained its kneeling position with the peculiar collective stubbornness of a congregation mid-prayer, during which Drath's intelligence staff exhausted their immediate resources and returned with nothing useful. No Vox signature, no known chapter iconography, no Mechanicus recognition pattern, no match in any Xenos catalog the local Arbites had access to. He was not a space marine. He was built like one, but the suit was wrong, the cape was wrong, the posture was wrong. Space Marines did not stand in plazas accepting devotion with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before and preferred it. 40 minutes during which Drath made a decision. He walked to the balcony edge and he raised his Crozius, and he addressed 2 million pilgrims with the amplified certainty of a man who understood that the first Vointony made owned that thing. And he said, in the resonant guidance he had perfected over 22 years, people of Vothara Prime, the Emperor, in his infinite grace, has sent us a sign on the day of his servant Aldrich's Jubilee. Behold the blessed instrument. Give thanks. The crowd gave thanks with the volume of a geological event. Below, in the crater, the man in the white suit lifted his head and looked up at the balcony, and even from that distance, Drath could see the corner of his mouth move. Homelander smiled. He had felt crowds before. He had felt the particular electricity of a stadium, packed with people all oriented toward him, all frightened and delighted in the specific ratio he had learned to engineer. The fear just beneath the surface of the love just above the surface of the fear, the whole system calibrated by decades of public management, and the implicit threat that the love was more dangerous without his cooperation than with it. He had felt it, and it had never been enough. This was different. 2 million people who did not know who he was, who had never seen a television or a marketing campaign or a carefully managed press release. Infrastructure of constructed mythology surrounding his image, who were responding to him with everything they had because he had come down from the sky and landed in their midst like a prophecy they had been waiting for since birth. There was no management here, no Vought PR filter, no carefully calibrated public narrative. This was raw. This was the direct signal without the carrier wave, and it hit him in places the crowds back home had never reached. He floated upward, slowly, deliberately, rising until he was level with the basilica's high windows, until he was above the banners, until the crowd below could see him silhouetted against the evening sky, and he let the cape spread behind him, and he held the position for exactly as long as a god should hold it. And the noise from below was the closest thing to what he had always suspected he deserved. Cardinal Drath met him on the high walkway that connected the basilica's bell tower to the northern transept. He was a small man for the weight he carried, narrow in the shoulder. The gold of his vestments was real gold, the fabric so heavily embroidered with sacred imagery that the cloth itself was barely visible. He held his Crozius with the particular grip of a man who had carried it so long it was part arm rather than a tool in his hand. He looked at Homelander the way a chess player looks at a piece he does not recognize, and his first words were not a greeting. "I need to know what you want," Drath said. "I heard what you called me," Homelander said. "Blessed instrument, I like that." "Names are tools," Drath said. "I use them when they're useful. What do you want from this world?" Homelander looked at him with the calm of a man assessing how long it would take to reduce the conversation to rubble if necessary, and decided it was not yet necessary. "I want what I always want," he said. "I want people to understand what I am. I want them to look at me the way they were looking at me down there." Drath was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "That," he said carefully, "may be possible to arrange." What followed was not an alliance. It was a mutual exploitation wearing the costume of one. Drath understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent 22 years managing the relationship between symbols and the populations that needed them, that the stranger's arrival could be weaponized. The Jubilee of St. Aldrich was watched across 9 subsectors via astropathic relay. An appearance of divine intervention at the most watched religious event in a generation would consolidate Drath's influence in ways that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with power. He would name the stranger, control the narrative, position himself as the interpreter between the miraculous and the faithful. He did not yet understand that the stranger had spent his entire life being interpreted by someone else, and that he was done with that. For 3 days, it held. For 3 days, Homelander moved through the Jubilee observances at Drath's side, dressed in the same white and red that had become already, among the pilgrims, a recognized iconography, already being reproduced in crude devotional illustrations sold from cart stalls in the lower plazas. He spoke when Drath arranged for him to speak, in short declarations that the cardinal approved in advance. He laid hands on the sick in the basilica's medical annexes, and he visited the hospice tents at the plaza's edge, and the genuinely dying looked at him with a joy so pure it was almost unbearable to be near. He walked through streets where people pressed themselves against walls to feel the passage of his shadow and wept without knowing why. He collected all of it, every expression of it. He found that he could feel them, not hear their thoughts, not commune with them in any mystical sense, but feel the emotional texture of a crowd the way a bat feels the shape of a cave. Through some new resonance the 41st millennium had woken in him that he did not have words for yet. The devotion had a flavor here, a depth. It was older and heavier and less conditional than anything he had known. These people worshipped because the alternative was madness. They worshipped because without the object of worship the darkness pressed in from every seat. And the darkness here was not metaphorical. It was on the third evening that the first crack appeared. A fraterist militia officer named Veskar, a humorless man with 20 years of enforcing ecclesiastical law behind his eyes, brought a theological objection to Drath's chambers in writing, as was protocol, which was the only reason Homelander did not hear it immediately. The objection stated that the veneration being directed at the blessed instrument was structurally indistinguishable from direct worship of a mortal figure, which the Lectitio Divinitatis was clear, was a form of heresy, that the Emperor's light could be celebrated in a servant's actions, but the servant could not be the object of prayer, and that the crowds in the lower plaza had been observed constructing a small shrine with the stranger's silhouette at its center where the aquila should be. Drath burned the report. He was not fast enough. Homelander had been in the next room, not listening through the door that was beneath him. He had listened through the wall, through the stone, through the 2 inches of solid ferrocrete with his heat dialed to a frequency the officer's low voice barely registered as more than vibration. He had done it because 6 hours earlier, for the first time since arriving, he had felt the texture of the crowd shift. Still devoted, still warm, but underneath the devotion, a new note, a hesitance, a question being asked in the back of collective thought that had not been there the day before, and he had wanted to know what was generating it. He stood outside Drath's door for 4 seconds, and then he opened it without knocking. The Cardinal turned. His expression did not change in any way that would have been visible to a normal man. To Homelander, who had learned to read the micro-expressions of people who were afraid of him before they knew they were afraid of him, it was as clear as a confession. "You were going to manage this," Homelander said, "the way they manage things back home." "I was going to contextualize it within ecclesiastical doctrine," Drath said, "which is not the same thing." "It is exactly the same thing," Homelander said. His voice was quiet. That was when it was worst, when it was quiet. "They're worshipping me. They can feel what I am. They understand it. You want to take that and put it in a box that says it's about your dead emperor, which means it's really about you, because you're the one who decides what the box says." Drath looked at him for a long moment. He was 74 years old and had faced down 3 inquisitors, 2 heretical cardinals, a demon host that had taken the form of his predecessor, and a tithe renegotiation with Lord Sector Gravian that had lasted 4 weeks. He had never been afraid of someone for purely physical reasons. He was discovering something new. "The Emperor," he said, "is the single point of unity for the entire human race. 120 billion souls across this galaxy are held together by that one name, that one symbol, that one act of sacrifice. If I allow a new figure to splinter that unity, even here, even in this one jubilee, I do not know what door I am opening. I am not protecting doctrine. I am protecting the species." Homelander looked at him. "I don't care," he said simply. flatly, without cruelty, which was in some ways worse than cruelty, about any of that. In the sub-levels of the administratum quarter, in an office that officially processed pilgrimage accommodation requests and unofficially processed rather different kinds of communication, a man who called himself Velantus received the daily report from his 3 embedded watchers among the Jubilee crowd. He read it slowly. He was by nature a slow reader, not from deficiency but from pleasure, savoring the shapes of words the way others savored wine. He had been slowly for 40 years, in this position and the 4 before it, and the slowness had made him careful in the way that only long patience can, careful the way a spider's web is careful, every thread placed with the understanding that it will wait as long as necessary. The reports confirmed what he had suspected since the stranger arrived. This being was not demonic. It had no warp presence, no chaos alignment, no mark of any of the 4 patrons. It was simply a mortal creature of extraordinary capability who had been, in whatever universe had shaped it, fed on something the Prince of Pleasure recognized as sustenance, excess. Not excess of pleasure or pain or sensation in the usual forms, but excess of a particular kind. Devotion directed at a single point, 2 million souls all focused on the same object, the psychic resonance of mass worship concentrated in one receiver. Valentus put the report down and looked at the ceiling, and thought about what it would mean to redirect that resonance. If the stranger could be turned, even partially, even for an hour, the warp resonance of 2 million worshippers redirected from the Emperor's name to something Slaanesh could touch would not merely delight the Prince of Pleasure. It would be, in the technical theological vocabulary of the cult, a feast. It would carve a channel into the local warp substrate that nothing short of a Grey Knight's full purification could cloud forward. And channels, once carved, took decades to fully scar over. He wrote 3 notes. He sent all 3. He began to wait with the patience that had made him over 40 years extremely effective. On the 5th day after Homelander's arrival, the Jubilee of St. Aldrich entered its ceremonial second half. The procession of the reliquary itself, the great brass coffin ship that held the saint's preserved body, drawn by 14 servo-haulers on tracks laid fresh every 300 years directly down the center of the grand processional. Cardinal Drath had decided that the blessed instrument would walk alongside the reliquary, an image, a statement, the stranger's approval of the ecclesiarchy's tradition, rendered in one public procession, that the astropathic imagery would carry to 9 subsectors within the week. He had not consulted Homelander about this. He realized his mistake approximately 8 seconds into the procession, when Homelander turned to him while the reliquary passed and said, loud enough for the nearest 50 rows of pilgrims to hear clearly, "Why should I walk beside a box when they came to see me?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then a voice in the crowd, a woman's voice, high and clear and fervent, called out, "Blessed instrument, blenstrument," and the name spread through the crowd the way a spark spreads through dry grass, fast and consuming and unstoppable before anyone with the authority to intervene understood what was happening. And the pilgrims were reaching toward him, not the reliquary, reaching past the reliquary, the procession breaking apart as the crowd pushed inward. The servo-haulers, halting as their operators registered the obstruction, the brass coffin ship of St. Aldrich sitting, motionless in the middle of the grand processional, while the crowd surged around it toward the figure standing on its right side. Drath gripped his Crozius and stared at the man beside him with 22 years of administrative fury compressed into a point. Homelander did not look at him. He was looking at the crowd. His eyes were bright with something that was not quite joy and not quite hunger, something that sat between them, something that required both to exist. He raised one hand, slowly, and the reaching stopped and the calling stopped, and 2 million people held their breath and waited. "I am here," he said. The sound that came from 2 million people who needed, in the grim darkness of this era, to believe that something was here for them was not applause. It was larger than that. It was the sound of a pressure releasing, a held breath exhaled on a cosmic scale. It moved through Homelander like a frequency, and it did something to the junction between his nervous system and whatever had been waking in him since his arrival, and for one long moment he stood in the center of it, and he was, in a way he had never been before, genuinely satisfied. In a private booth 40 rows back, a nondescript man in pilgrimage robes lowered his offering vial and smiled. Valentus had come in person. He did this sometimes with candidates. It was more efficient to assess them directly. What he felt when the crowd's collective devotion spiked was better than the report had suggested. Much better. The stranger was not just drawing worship, he was conducting it, channeling it in ways he did not understand himself, the way a natural telepath generates warp disturbance without training or intent, not because they are chaos-touched, but because the warp is shaped by consciousness, and strong enough consciousness shapes back. 2 million souls worshipping a single receiver, and the receiver amplifying the signal without knowing it was doing so. The warp resonance reading was, in Valentus's experienced estimation, approximately 40% of what it would need to be for the channel carving to begin. He needed to push it higher. He needed the stranger's hunger to be fed a little more, and then suddenly threatened, and then fed again. He needed the cycle of devotion and withdrawal that Slanesh's favored methodology dictated, because the Prince of Pleasure had taught its chosen that the most powerful resonance was not pure joy, but the oscillation between joy and its removal. What he needed was simple. He needed Cardinal Drath to do exactly what Cardinal Drath was almost certainly going to do. He sent his fourth note. The confrontation between Drath and Homelander happened that evening in the Cardinal's private study, and it was conducted at a lower temperature than either participant would have chosen, which made it more dangerous. Drath had spent the afternoon receiving communications from 3 subsector bishops, 1 Ordos Hereticus attach, and 2 senior members of his own staff, all of which said variations of the same thing. This is beyond the bounds of permitted veneration. This is structurally heretical. This threatens the unity of imperial faith in this subsector. Deal with it. The attache's message was slightly different from the others. It said, "We are aware of the situation, we are monitoring, and we will take what action is necessary if you cannot manage this," and the implication of what action is necessary was not subtle. Drath laid the facts before Homelander without ceremony. The veneration had to be redirected. The shrine in the lower plaza had to be dismantled. The name Blessed Instrument had to be formally subordinated in all official communications to its full meaning as an instrument of the Emperor's will, rather than as an object of worship in its own right. It was not a request. Homelander listened to all of it. He sat very still while Drath spoke, which Drath recognized from his years of managing difficult men as the posture of someone deciding between options, not between compliance and refusal, but between different ways of refusing. "Let me explain something to you," Homelander said when Drath finished. "Back where I come from there was a company. They built me. They made me what I am, and they spent 30 years explaining to me, very carefully, in private, that they owned the narrative, and that the narrative was more important than the reality, which was a way of saying that they were more important than me, and I let them, for a long time, because I needed people to love me and they had the machine that produced that love, so I thought the machine was necessary." He paused. The heat shimmer around his eyes was not quite visible, but it was not quite invisible either. "I was wrong about that. The machine was just management. What I am does not require management. What I am requires recognition, and if you get between me and recognition, you are not doing what you think you're doing. You think you're protecting something. You're just putting yourself in front of something that will go through you." Drath looked at him for a long time. "Then we have a problem," the Cardinal said. "No," Homelander said. "You have a problem." He left through the wall, not the door, the wall. Because he could and because the texture of the crowd was outside and the crowd was the only thing that felt real. In the Administratum Quarter, Valentus received the report of this exchange from his watcher in the Cardinal's staff, and he set down his pen and permitted himself a single slow breath of satisfaction. The oscillation was beginning. The Cardinal would tighten his grip. The stranger would pull against it. The crowd would feel the tension, and the worship would heat with it, the way an argument between gods heats the air, and the people below feel it as weather. He began drafting the pamphlet. It would appear in the lower plaza by dawn, printed on standard pilgrimage stock, quoting the morning's events in language that was entirely accurate and entirely inflammatory. The next 72 hours reshaped Vothara Prime. The pamphlet appeared, as Valentus had intended, attributable to no one in particular, and it spread through the lower plazas with the efficiency of a thing whose content perfectly matched the anxieties already present in the crowd. The question it raised was theological, but its effect was political. If the Blessed Instrument's miracles in the hospice tents were the Emperor's work, why had the Cardinal placed him beside St. Aldrich's relic rather than above it? The phrasing was precise, the word above was precise. By the morning of the 8th day, 2 separate factions had formed in the upper plazas alone. Those who held to the Cardinal's interpretation, that the stranger was an instrument of imperial will, and those who held to the interpretation the pamphlet had carefully suggested, that the Emperor's will had arrived in person. Seraphinus Drath read the pamphlet and recognized immediately that it had been written by someone who understood exactly what it would do. He ordered his intelligence staff to find the author. He placed 3 additional Frateris militia battalions at the Basilica gates. He drafted a formal theological clarification for morning distribution that his own staff told him privately would not reach the lower plazas, before the pamphlet had already generated 3 responses. He was right, it did not. Homelander moved through all of this like a weather pattern rather than a participant, which was partly deliberate and partly the natural behavior of someone who had never needed to win debates, because debates were never actually about him being right. They were about everyone around him deciding how afraid they wanted to be. He visited the hospice tents on the 7th and 8th days without Drath's permission, and he healed nothing in any clinical sense. He had no healing ability he was aware of, but he was present, and he spoke to people, and the specific quality of his presence, the certainty of it, the density of it, the sense that being near him was being near something that could not be hurt and therefore could not be lost, produced in the dying a peace that the Basilica's own confessors spent their entire careers trying and largely failing to generate. The confessors noticed. They were not all displeased. 2 of them sent in formal messages through their chapter networks that Drath intercepted and read with growing resignation. On the 9th day, Justicar Emmerich Vale translated in system. The Grey Knight's frigate Vow of Severance arrived at the edge of Vothara Prime's gravity well in the early hours of the 9th day and held station there without announcing itself on any standard Vox channel, which was standard practice for the Prognosticar's deployment fleet. It sent a single tight beam transmission to the Ordo Malleus receptor in the Basilica's deepest annex, a receptor that Cardinal Drath did not officially know existed, and it said 3 things. The warp resonance signature above Vothara Prime had escalated significantly in the past 48 hours. The signature was being analyzed but was atypical, and Justicar Vale and his strike force were proceeding to the surface for personal assessment. They came down in the dark hours before the pilgrimage crowds gathered, 5 figures in silver-grey ceramite, with no insignia visible from outside, and no explanation offered to the Arbite's checkpoint that saw them pass. The checkpoint officer making the particular decision that checkpoint officers in the Imperium make when faced with beings in power armor who do not explain themselves, which is to stand aside and document the event very carefully for someone else to be responsible for. Vile was 43 years into his service, an age by which Grey Knights were either dead or had accumulated a specific kind of weight that sat differently in the body than muscle or armor. He moved through the Basilica's service tunnels with the efficiency of a man who had cleared worse corridors and spoke only to his team until he reached the level below the Cardinal's study, where a brief conversation with the Ordos Attache produced a 2-hour summary of events, a personal assessment that the Attache himself was not certain whether this was demonic incursion or extremely dangerous heresy, or some third category they did not have a procedure for, and a recommendation that Vale make his own assessment before taking action. Vale sat with the summary for 20 minutes. He asked 2 questions. The first was about the warp resonance signature and whether it had stabilized or was still escalating. The attach said it was escalating. The second question was about the location of the figure at the center of it. The attach told him. Vale found Homelander in the early morning on the basilica's outer terrace, the long limestone walkway that overlooked the lower plaza, before the pilgrims had assembled for the day, before the censers were lit. He was standing at the terrace rail in the grey pre-dawn light, looking at the empty plaza below, and either he had known Vale was approaching for 30 seconds, or he had excellent composure, because he did not turn at the sound of ceramite on limestone. "I was wondering when someone with armor showed up," Homelander said. "My name is Justicar Emmerich Vale," Vale said. He stopped 6 feet away. "I have come to assess a situation that is of concern to my organization." "What organization?" "One you don't have a name for. Knowing its name would not change your situation." Homelander turned then. He looked at the Justicar the way he looked at all soldiers, measuring the specific kind of authority they carried, and whether it was the kind backed by personal capability or the kind backed only by institutional structure, and he found, with the particular sensitivity he had developed over a lifetime of assessing threats, that this one was different. Not in the way Space Marines were different, which was massive and immediate and obvious. Different in a quieter way, like something that had been made specifically for one purpose, and that purpose had shaped it entirely. "You feel different," Homelander said. "You feel like a resonance point," Vale said. "The warp signature above this world has tripled in 48 hours. You are the cause. I don't know what the warp is. It is the substrate of reality beneath the physical. It is shaped by consciousness. Sufficient amounts of certain types of emotion, focused on a single point, can carve permanent channels in it. What is happening here is that kind of focusing. Whether you are the cause or the instrument of something else, I cannot yet say." Homelander was quiet for a moment. "And if I'm the cause, then this stops," Vale said. "One way or another." The plaza below was still empty. The skies was beginning to lighten, the first pale grey before the sun, the pre-dawn color that made everything look like ash. Somewhere below, the first pilgrims were already gathering at the gate lines, the early arrivals who wanted the nearest positions to the processional route, who had perhaps slept at the gate, who had walked 11 days and were not going to let the last hour undo that. "You're going to tell me," Homelander said slowly, "that the thing that's been happening here, those people giving me what I'm owed, that's actually dangerous. You're going to tell me that I have to stop, because the universe has rules, and I don't get to break them. You are generating a warp resonance that, if it continues, will draw entities from the immaterium that will kill every person in those plazas," Vale said. "Not because they are evil. Because they are attracted to what you're generating the way sharks are attracted to blood. The analogy is imprecise, but it will do." Something moved in Homelander's expression. Something that was not anger but sat adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man who is hearing an argument that he cannot immediately dismiss, but that threatens something he refuses to give up. "I am not going to stop," he said, "just so we're clear on where this is going." "Then I will stop you," Vale said, simply, without aggression, the way a surgeon states an intention. The first blow came from Homelander, because Vale's weapon had not cleared its scabbard when the heat vision fired. Not at Vale. At the space between them, the limestone of the terrace surface, explosive vaporization of stone that sent a shockwave through the air hard enough to stagger a man in ceramite, and Homelander was already moving, already airborne, the speed of the takeoff cracking the railing behind him, and the fight went vertical. It lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes above the Basilica Orantia in the pre-dawn grey. 2 figures moving at speeds that the pilgrims now beginning to fill the lower plazas could follow only as afterimages and the percussion of impacts, as concussive waves of displaced air that swung the sensors on their chains and set the devotional banners streaming sideways. The nearest buildings in the Administratum Quarter lost windows. A servo skull relay station on the Basilica's north tower detonated when the concussion wave hit it. Vale was not invulnerable. He was something more precise than invulnerable. He was trained against the specific things the warp produced, which were immense and wrong in ways that the mind could not process. and Homelander was not that. He was powerful in the physical register, structurally powerful, the kind of power that bent ceramite and shattered stone and moved too fast for unaugmented senses to track. But he was a physical problem, and Val had been solving physical problems for 4 decades. The Nemesis Force sword was already resonating with the Justicar's psychic will, and when it connected with Homelander's left arm, the effect was not injury in the conventional sense but disruption, a deep vibration in whatever systems his body used to do what it did, like striking a gyroscope and watching the stability briefly fail. Homelander dropped 20 meters before he corrected. He looked at the cut on his forearm. Not deep, barely a mark, but there was a mark. He had not had a mark from a blade since he was 6 years old in a laboratory he was not supposed to remember. He looked up at Vale and the heat vision fired, not at the space between them this time, directly at the Justicar, and even ceramite has a threshold, and at the range they were at, the Vow of Severance's captain, watching from orbit, cursed and began calculating landing trajectories. Vale went back through the Basilica's bell tower. The ceramite held. The man inside it did not dead. Grey Knights were not built to die from a single blow, even one of this magnitude, even fired at the resonant frequency that Homelander had found without knowing he was finding it. But Vael was on the bell tower floor with one arm not responding, and the internal display in his helmet showing damage assessments that were going to require significant time and the attention of a tech marine he did not currently have access to. He had 4 remaining members of his strike force. He reached them on the Vox. "Fall back to the frigate," he said. "I said, fall back. Document everything. Send full telemetry to the prognosticars. I need a week and a librarian." He let the response come through, and then he focused on the particular task of remaining conscious while the sound of a crowd below registered the appearance of their blessed instrument dropping back into the plaza from a great height, and the roar of their welcoming him back, and the sensation that came through the floor of the bell tower of collective devotion, directed at a single point, intensifying again. He needed a week. He was not certain the world had a week. The warp resonance spike that accompanied Homelander's return to the plaza after the fight was, in the vocabulary of the prognosticars, a surge, not a catastrophic one, but measurable. The kind that registered in the dreams of Vothara Prime's 3 sanctioned psychers as a sudden brightness behind closed eyes. The kind that made the Basilica's anti-warp wards at a pitch they were not designed to maintain continuously. In the Administratum Quarter, Valentus felt it in his own warp-aligned senses, the 40-year cultivation of sensitivity that was the primary tool of his trade, and he recalculated. The timeline was shorter than he had planned for. The fight had accelerated things. The crowd had seen their blessed instrument confront an armored figure and survive, which in the collective theology of the 41st millennium's pilgrims, in a moment of psychological pressure, translated to something very specific. He had been tested by the holy and found greater. The devotion had moved past worship. It was closer to reverence now, the kind reserved for the emperor himself. Valentus sent his 5th note. It was addressed not to his watchers but to his patron's receiver, the resonant crystal communication medium that the Prince of Pleasure's servants used across vast distances, and it said simply, "It is time." The cult had been embedded in the Administratum Quarter for 4 years, 43 members across the pilgrimaged subsort structure, all ordinary seeming on the surface, all carrying within them the mark of Slanesh in forms too subtle for the standard Arbite's inspection to detect. Valentus had built them carefully, one at a time, choosing for patience and discretion rather than fervor, because fervor was useful in the final moments and catastrophic in all the moments before. They came now from their offices and their processing stations, and their supply depots to the central atrium of the Administratum Quarter's main complex. And Valentus looked at them for a long moment and told them what they were going to do. It was elegant. He was proud of it. The plan did not involve attacking Homelander or the crowd or the ecclesiarchy directly. It involved a single ritual component, a specific sequence of harmonic resonance using the 43 members as the nodes of a network. That would not be readable as sorcery from outside. That would layer itself over the existing warp resonance generated by the crowd's devotion like a second voice in a chord. And that would, at the moment of its completion, redirect the resonance from the Emperor's general field into Slaanesh's direct receptors. 2 million souls worth of devotion, delivered, not as an offering they chose, as one they would never know they had made. The duration of the ritual was 20 minutes. He began at the 3rd hour, when the crowd in the plaza was at its daily maximum and Homelander was at the center of it, in the particular state that Valentus's watchers had learned to identify as the closest thing to peace the stranger seemed capable of. Surrounded, elevated, receiving. The first 5 minutes ran cleanly, then the 6th minute, and the 7th, and the resonance was building exactly as modeled, and Valentus was beginning to feel the particular satisfaction of a long plan arriving at its destination, when he felt something he had not modeled and had not planned for, and did not immediately understand. The resonance was changing, not the ritual's resonance, the crowd's, the baseline. Homelander's. Something was shifting in the emotional texture of the crowd that was not a response to the ritual, but to something happening in the plaza itself. And Valentus reached for his watcher's sight lines and found that in the center of the plaza, the stranger had gone still, completely still. Not the comfortable stillness of someone receiving adoration, the stillness of someone who has heard something. Cardinal Seraphinus Drath had come to the plaza himself, in full vestments, with his full staff, and he had not come quietly. He had come with the Fratertaris militia formations behind him, and he had come with the amplification equipment that turned his voice into something that could be heard across the full breadth of the grand processional plaza. And he had begun to speak, and what he was saying was not a condemnation, not an accusation, but something more carefully structured than either. A theological recalibration, calm and precise, that placed the blessed instrument firmly within the doctrinal framework of imperial saints, which meant firmly beneath the emperor, which meant firmly within the cardinal's interpretive authority, which meant not the thing the crowd had been turning him into, in the collective privacy of their hearts and prayers. It was well done. Drath was good at this. He had been doing it for 22 years, and he was good. It did not matter. What mattered was that Homelander could feel the crowd's temperature drop, not by much, not all at once, but the specific oscillation Valentus had been relying on, the push and pull of devotion and its withdrawal, was happening now in a way that was not part of the cult's ritual, but that was feeding it anyway, amplifying it, the crowd's confusion turning into a kind of ambient grief that resonate on exact the frequencies Slaanesh consumed, and Valentus felt the channel beginning to open. 20 meters below the administratum atrium floor, in the maintenance conduits that ran beneath the whole quarter, his 43 members chanted. Homelander landed in front of Drath, not beside him, in front of him, 6 feet in front of him, between the cardinal and the crowd went very quiet in the way that very large things go quiet when they sense that the next 10 seconds will determine what the following hours look like. Stop, Homelander said. I am the spiritual authority on this world, Drath said. His voice through the amplifiers did not tremble. This is a matter of doctrine. I am not asking your permission. I'm not talking about doctrine, Homelander said. He was not looking at Drath. He was looking at the crowd, at the specific quality of uncertainty that had moved through them, the faith wavering, not collapsing but flexing, bending under the weight of 2 things demanding it simultaneously. Something is doing something to them. There's something underneath this that I can feel and you can't. Drath looked at him. That, said Vale's voice from the edge of the plaza, is correct. He was still in armor, one arm held at a careful angle that suggested the joint was not fully functional. He had come from the bell tower at a walk that covered the distance faster than a walk had any right to, and the 4 members of his strike force flanked him, and the Grey Knight's presence in the open plaza produced its own specific effect on a crowd of Imperials, the long-conditioned response to silver-grey ceramite that fell somewhere between reverence and existential dread. There is a Slaaneshi cult active in the administratum quarter, Vale said. They have been running a ritual for the past 7 minutes. They are using the resonance this gathering has been generating as a carrier. They need approximately 13 more minutes to complete it. I have 4 men and an injured arm, and I cannot clear that complex in 13 minutes, not cleanly. He looked at Homelander. But you could. The silence that followed was not long. Homelander had spent his entire life being given reasons why his power was a tool for someone else's agenda. He had heard it from Vought, from Stan Edgar, from every bureaucracy and institutional authority that had looked at what he was and seen a resource rather than a person. He had done many things in response to that pattern, over many years, most of them wrong. He had learned very little from most of them, but he had learned one thing, the thing that had taken him the longest to understand, because it required him to accept something painful. The people who controlled the narrative around his power were not all wrong about the danger of it. Some of them were wrong about whose danger it was, but the danger was real. He looked at the 2 million people in the plaza, the flickering uncertainty in the crowd's texture, the thing underneath it that he had been feeling for 7 minutes and had not been able to name. If I do this, he said, not to Vale, not to Drath, to the air, it doesn't mean I'm your weapon. No, Vale agreed. It means you are protecting the people under your care. What you are to me afterward is a separate conversation. Homelander was already moving. He did not take the door. He did not take any path a person using the building conventionally would take. He came through the administratum quarters' exterior wall at a height of 40 feet, through 3 inches of ferrocrete and the service ducting behind it, and the sound of his passage was a crack that ran along the building's face like a seam opening, and he was through and down and through the floor before the dust had settled. The maintenance conduit was the length of a city block, though silent, crowded with pipe runs and power conduits, lit by utility lumen strips at 10-meter intervals. 43 cultists in a network pattern, kneeling, hands joined, chanting in the language of Slaanesh that had no characters in any permitted script and no translation in any document the Inquisition would share with lower clearances. At the center of the network, kneeling and not chanting but conducting, hands spread with the particular precision of a man who had been doing this for 40 years, was Valentus. He heard the wall behind him fail. He turned. He had thought, in the abstract, about what would happen if direct physical force intervened before the ritual's completion. He had considered it a managed risk, low probability, because the ritual was underground and undetectable, and the only entity on this world capable of finding it by feel rather than by instrument was the stranger, and the stranger had been in the plaza receiving devotion and had no reason to leave it. He had not accounted for the stranger being given a reason. He had, for 40 years, been building plans on assumptions. This was the first time an assumption had walked through a wall. Homelander looked at the network of 43 kneeling figures and then at the man in the center of them, and then he looked, in the particular way he had been looking at things since arriving on this world, at the texture of what they were doing, the specific kind of wrongness it generated in the space between them, the sense of something being taken from people who did not know it was being taken. No, he said. He did not need 43 individual blows. He needed one, aimed correctly at the center of the network. He aimed it at Valentus, not because Valentus was the most physically dangerous person in the room. He was not. But because Valentus was the node that held the network in coherent shape, and disrupting the node was more efficient than disrupting each thread individually. The heat vision fired at a controlled intensity, enough to end the ritual, and the scream that came from the cultist network was not pain, precisely. It was the sound of a process interrupted, of something reaching and finding nothing, of 40 years of patient building arriving at the moment of completion and then dissolving. The channel did not open. Valentus, burning, had the presence of mind to be astonished, not at what had stopped him, at why the stranger had stopped him. A being that should have been the most potent offering in a generation. A being that Slaanesh had been positioning for since the moment it arrived, had chosen to deny the Prince of Pleasure rather than accept the worship the Prince was offering to redirect toward him. He looked up at the figure standing in the wreckage of his life's work. "You understand," Valentus said. his voice still even though the rest of him was not. That what we were offering you was everything you want, all of it, more of it than you have ever had. Yeah, Homelander said, I know, then why? Homelander was quiet for a moment. The question was a real one, and he considered it honestly, which was not something he did often. "'Cause it wasn't theirs to give," he said finally. "Those 2 million people out there. They didn't choose to give me anything. You were going to take it from them and hand it to me without them knowing. I don't want that." He paused, and something moved in his expression that was complicated and not entirely comfortable. "I want them to choose me. I want every single one of them to choose me on their own, not because someone routed their signal." The thing in his expression settled into something quieter and less comfortable. "That's the only version that's real." He left through the floor this time, back up through the conduit access and through the quarter's exterior wall, and back into the open air above the plaza. And the crowd below saw him emerge from the building and took it the way crowds take everything when they are 2 million strong and focused on a single point, as confirmation of what they already believed. In the plaza, Justicar Vale watched him descend and made the assessment he had been building since the terrace fight. The resonance above Vothara Prime was still elevated. It would remain elevated as long as the crowd and its object of devotion remained in proximity. But the channel had not opened. The ritual had been stopped by the same being, whose presence had made it possible, which created a theological and tactical category that the Grey Knights had no procedure for, and that Vial was going to need to report to the prognosticars with a full account and a personal recommendation. His recommendation was going to be unusual. He sat down on a broken section of plaza wall and let his injured arm rest and watched the figure at the center of the crowd for a long time. He had arrived on this world with the expectation of finding a demon prince in formation, or an unbound psyker generating catastrophic resonance by accident, or a deception of some kind, a figure projected or puppeted by something in the warp, for reasons he would have to spend days untangling. He had found none of those things. He had found something that did not fit any category he had been trained for, which, in his experience, was always the most significant finding. Cardinal Seraphinus Drath came to stand beside him. His vestments were dusty from the clearing of the lower quarter, where the Frateris militia was now dealing with the aftermath of the disrupted ritual in ways that were efficient if not gentle. "What happens now?" Drath said, not as a question but as an opening position. "That depends on several things," Vale said. "On him, partly on what my order decides he is, partly on whether he chooses to stay or leave." Drath looked at the crowd. At the center of the crowd, the figure in white and red was not flying, not performing, not giving a speech. He was standing in the middle of 2 million people who loved him, and he was letting them. And for once the texture of it was something less like hunger, and more like the particular quiet of a person who is for the first time uncertain whether the thing they have always wanted is the thing that they need. "He'll stay," Drath said. "Probably," Vale agreed. "That is going to be a very complicated problem." "Yes." Drath looked at his Crozius and then put it away. "I have been managing this world's faith for 22 years. I have never in those 22 years had to manage something that was actually present, that actually showed up. That is not a symbol." Vel did not have an answer for that. It was not a tactical problem, it was something older. In the weeks that followed, the Jubilee ended and the pilgrims dispersed, and Vothara Prime attempted to return to something resembling its ordinary configuration, which it found it could not entirely manage. The shrine in the lower plaza that Drath had ordered dismantled was rebuilt twice. The devotional illustrations sold from the cart stalls now included a new image alongside St. Aldrich's reliquary, a figure in white with a cape descending from a golden sky. The hospice records from the Jubilee period showed anomalous recovery rates that the Medicae Fraternis was still trying to explain. 3 of the Basilica's confessors had independently drafted theological arguments for a new category of imperial saint that did not fit the existing canonization framework. Justicar Vale remained on world. His frigate held station in orbit. His report to the prognosticators generated 17 separate responses from entities he had never personally corresponded with before, which was unprecedented. And the consensus of those responses was that there was no precedent, and that his continued observation was authorized, and his tactical judgment on the ground was deferred to until further analysis was complete. He and Homelander did not become allies. They became something harder to name. Two beings in the same space, both aware of what the other was, neither fully understanding it, watching each other with the steady attention of two things that have recognized in each other a seriousness they cannot entirely dismiss. On the 62nd day after Homelander's arrival, he sat on the outer terrace of the basilica in the early morning and looked at the empty plaza below, and Vale came and sat at the far end of the terrace, maintaining the distance that had become their baseline. And after a long silence, Homelander said, "The thing you were worried about, the channel. Could that happen again, without someone doing a ritual to make it happen?" Vale considered the question carefully. "Yes. If the devotion concentrated enough and you amplified it without understanding what you were doing. Then I need to understand what I'm doing." Another silence. "That," Vale said, "would be the first thing you've said that makes my continued presence here uncomplicated." Homelander looked at him. "I don't want it to be uncomplicated for you." "I know," Vale said. "It is anyway." On Terra, impossibly far away, the Golden Throne's mechanisms labored as they'd had labored for 10,000 years, and the light that maintained the Astronomicon reached across the galaxy's dark distances, touching every psyker, every navigator, every soul attuned to the beacon that held human civilization together by sheer sustained will. It touched Vothara Prime as it touched every world in the Imperium. In the grand processional plaza, where the morning was grey and cold, and the incense smoke was rising from the first lit censer, the light found the new resonance there, the mark of something that had not been there before the Jubilee, and if the attention of a dying god could be said to move, it moved, briefly, toward a shrine world in the 5th subsector, where 2 million pilgrims had chosen something, and that something was still present, still being chosen, still learning, in the long, agonizing way of all-powerful things, what it meant to be responsible for what you were. He was not a saint, he was not a weapon, he was not a symbol, or not only a symbol, or not the right kind of symbol for the institutions that needed him to be one. He was a man built by a dead civilization's worst impulses, dropped into a civilization built entirely on survival, and he was learning the difference between worship given because there is no alternative and worship given because it is true. The galaxy had not made that distinction for 10,000 years. It was a distinction, perhaps, worth the making. In the grim darkness of the far future, where gods walked in the warp and saints burned on pyres of their own faith, something new had landed. Something that craved what this age could not afford to give freely, and that craving and that scarcity were, between them, the most human thing in the galaxy. The desire to be loved, and the universe's long refusal to make it easy.